Welcome to Immigration Law for Tech Startups. Sophie Alcorn's mission is to overcome borders, expand opportunity, and connect the world by practicing compassionate, visionary, and rigorous immigration law in service of the betterment of humanity. Immigration Law for Tech Startups features immigration law strategies to empower global leaders to influence change regardless of their geographic location, place of birth, or citizenship. Now, here's your host, Sophie Alcorn.
Hello, welcome back to Immigration Law for Tech Startups. This is Sophie, and today I am so excited to be joined by my wonderful colleague, Lynda Hagerty. She is our Chief Legal Officer for Excellence at Alcorn Immigration Law. And today we're going to be telling you everything you need to know about getting ready for the next H-1B season, which officially starts now. Even though the lottery isn't until March, it is imperative that any companies who know about their candidates already get started today on taking the right actions to get your candidates in the lottery. So we're going to be talking all about that today. Welcome to the show, Lynda. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Sophie, for having me. I'm so excited to be on the show today.
Thank you. Well, I would love for you to introduce yourself a little bit more and share with our listeners around the world some of your background.
Sure, I would love to. So I'm a business immigration attorney, and I've been practicing business immigration law for about 20 years with boutique-style firms. So this is definitely my wheelhouse, H-1B lottery. I graduated from UMass School of Management with a bachelor's degree in business. And, I studied law in Boston at Suffolk University. So I'm really excited to be here and share any information I can on CAP season.
Thank you so much. And one of the things that I think really stands out about your lawyering, not just your depth of experience, but also excited to have you here today because I love the way you explain things. I think it's really helpful to our clients who maybe have never been in the immigration process before and they have a lot of questions and it can feel super confusing. But I love the way you explain things. So,
thank you, Sophie.
Yeah, you're so very welcome. You're so very welcome. So listeners on the podcast, if you look at the old episodes, we've done lots on H-1Bs from different perspectives, H-1Bs for startup founders, H-1B transfers, H-1B extensions, H-1B lotteries in past years. But here we're really going to talk about some of the most important, frequently asked questions about H-1Bs. So of course, there are more resources for you to listen to, but what I'm excited about for this conversation is that it's a fresh 2022 take on all the latest updates and also just Lynda's perspective and clear way of explaining things. And it's always fun to look at something from a new perspective. And then some of you have never heard anything about H-1B. You're just like, oh yeah, I need one of those, but I don't know what it is. So maybe we could start off there, Lynda. What's an H-1B?
So an H-1B is a temporary work visa that allows professionals who are foreign nationals to come into the U.S. and work for a U.S. employer. The role that they're filling must require a bachelor's degree in a specialized field, and they must have a bachelor's degree or equivalent in a specialized field that directly relates to that U.S. role.
So it's to work for a company?
Yes. It's very specific to the company.
Okay. And how long is it usually valid? How does that work?
So the H-1B can be issued in 3-year increments up to 6 years with all employers. So that's the total timeline. But there's some exceptions, like everything else in immigration law, to extending beyond that 6-year maximum.
Okay. So super high level overview. If I run a company and I want to hire somebody, this is a way for me to get a new hire into our team from another country. Because I can't just go hire anybody. I have to get specific authorization. And so this is one of the ways that I could hire somebody, and I have to look for people with bachelor's degrees who are doing well. And you can tell us more about this, but it's not just any job. And I think we'll be getting to that more in a little bit, right?
Yes, absolutely. We're going to take a deep dive into that.
Okay. And so if I'm a person looking for a job from a H-1B perspective, what are some of the things that I would need to think about whether this visa is going to be right for me and the type of job I want to have?
Well, you have to first make sure from an employee perspective, there has to be a viable employer that can sponsor them for the H-1B. So this would be a U.S. company. Yeah, an offer, right. So they have to, yeah, exactly. But the company that's making the offer has to be a viable company, right?
Okay.
So we do work with startups and we have some creative solutions in those scenarios for sure. But the company has to be a viable company.
Okay. Cool. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons. So we know an H-1B is a working visa. It's for certain jobs, for certain companies. It's usually available for 3 years at a time. What are some of the good things about it?
So one of the great things about H-1B is the flexibility that it provides the workers. If someone is awarded an H-1B and they're working for a U.S. employer and they want to change employers, they can transfer their H-1B to a new company and they can start working for that new company when that transfer is filed with USCIS.
Okay, so you're not stuck in one company forever if you're the employee. It's not like an L visa, for example, where it's just good for one family of companies. And I guess if you're an employer, there's more risk for you, but it's basically at-will employment, pretty much like any other employee. So it's not a way to trick people into staying with you if you have bad employment practices.
Yeah,
Okay.
no.
Good to know. Can you have multiple roles? Do you have to work full-time?
No. So like the H-1B, you can have simultaneous H-1Bs with different employers. I mean, it's typically not the norm, but in some cases you may have a part-time job and then take another part-time job, or, you have a full-time job and then you take on another part-time job. So you are allowed to do that in the H-1B context.
Okay, great. But you probably have to ask permission every time, right?
Exactly, right.
Okay.
So if you have concurrent H's, you have to go through the whole process of filing with USCIS each time.
Okay. Is it fast?
It can be. So there is premium processing, which is 15-day adjudication, which USCIS does offer for H-1Bs. There's a filing fee of $2,500 that's payable for that type of fast track processing. And we think it's really valuable because you get a lot of communication from USCIS. You'll get email notification of acceptance, of approval. It's definitely a great way to go if you are pursuing an H-1B and that's an option that's available to you.
Yeah, in the past, I had people maybe 10 years ago worry that they would be subject to higher scrutiny with premium processing and there's a higher risk of an RFE or a denial. But we had such extreme backlogs over the last few years with COVID that people kind of just said whatever and did it anyway. Mm-hmm. And of course, the government would say, no, there's no preferential treatment. But what's your experience on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I had the same mindset. I think we always had a fear of getting a fast decision wasn't necessarily going to be a good thing sometimes. Mm-hmm. But in my experience, when you have a more complex case, because you have a better communication chain with USCIS, I think it's actually preferable to file a complex case with premium processing now.
Because then as a lawyer, you have more opportunities to provide additional information or communicate if there's any issues.
Right. Or if they make some kind of error, which does happen from time to time, they will respond to your request. There's also something called supervisory review, which is only available for premium processing. So if you do have a denial, let's say, you can make a written request for supervisory review, which is kind of a nice feature of premium processing.
Yeah, that's great. Are there any other benefits of the H-1B?
Absolutely. H-1B workers can also pursue a green card. So this is a category that permits what's called dual intent. Mm-hmm. So, students, F1 students, when they're coming to study, that's their purpose and they can't have intentions to pursue a green card. But that changes for H-1B workers. So it's a great pathway for a future green card.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. Okay. So we've talked about several of the pros. How about any cons of the H-1B?
I mean, I think the biggest concern is always that timeline, right? So we talked earlier about it being valid in 3-year increments, up to 6 years total. So I think that clock is always ticking for an H-1B worker, so they want to be aware of that.
Mm-hmm. And then companies want to make sure that if you are an H-1B employer, it's important that you are also monitoring this for your employees so that you don't get caught in a situation where you haven't filed the appropriate green card documents for them, and now they have to leave the country because their H-1B expired.
Exactly. That's really important. And so, just sort of as a benchmark, if you have the first phase of the green card process, perm, filed before the end of your 5th year in H-1B status, then you could start to extend your H-1B beyond that 6-year maximum.
Okay. So it's really, really important for people to monitor. How about when it comes to families, like if somebody's thinking about getting an H-1B for the first time, what do they need to be aware of about whether their family can come, a spouse, a kid, what rights those people will have in their families?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there is a derivative visa that's available for the spouse and children of an H-1B holder. So that's nice that they can come to the U.S. They just don't have any work authorization that's automatically tied to that status. There is a pathway for an H-4 spouse if the primary H-1B applicant is in the green card process and gets far enough along. But generally, that's going to take a fair amount of time to get to that step where work authorization is available to the spouse.
Okay. So spouse can come, kids under 21 can come, spouse can't work on an H-4 unless second stage of the green card is approved or unless the spouse switches to some other type of independent work visa.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
What's kind of interesting about the spouse too, Sophie, is we talk about that 6-year H-1B timeline for the primary H-1B holder. There isn't a timeline for H-4 status. So, you don't have the clock ticking. So sometimes you'll see a spouse say, I'm going to work on my work authorization card when they get to that point, because they don't have a time maximum that attaches while they're in H-4 status.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay. So there's some ways to use this to your advantage within the system, the way it's constructed. Cool.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. And so if somebody has never had an H-1B and they want to get one, typically, and I know we do creative solutions with H-1Bs that are cap exempt with no lottery, but what's the typical way that most people in the United States would end up with an H-1B each year for the first time?
Right. So the first time you apply under this annual lottery that we keep talking about, the cap lottery. Mm-hmm. And so this whole process is very structured around a specific timeline that correlates with the federal fiscal year. The first part of this lottery is this registration period that happens in March, when companies can register potential employees for H-1Bs through this online system. And it runs for maybe 2 weeks in March. And then April 1, the USCIS will do the selection for those that were chosen as lottery recipients, who then have 90 days to file a petition with USCIS that's employer sponsored, so they can secure their H-1B.
Okay. So if a company is listening to this now, and we anticipate this podcast will be released in fall of 2022, and they've never done the H-1B lottery before, but they're thinking about it. You just said it happened in March, but should they be doing something now?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can never start too early for cap season. I'll say that. Before the holidays even, start to pull together a list of potential candidates that you might want to sponsor, because we'll need the job descriptions for those candidates. We'll also need qualification documents for each of the beneficiaries, resume, education, immigration status. So thinking ahead is really smart. And then we can also try to assess any issues that might come up or might be something that would red flag the case.
And we get really busy in the first quarter with demand for our services from brand new clients. And so it's always easier for us to do these cases for a repeat client. But if somebody's brand new and they already know they want to do this, really the sooner you can contact us, the easier it will be for us to support you to get your case done early and, let you know everything you need to do. Okay. And what about from the candidate perspective? If you know that your employer is going to put you into the lottery this year or, in March, what should candidates be doing to prepare to have it go as smoothly as possible?
Well, once the case really gets moving from our side, we're going to start to collect documents from the candidate or the beneficiary. And really, depending upon their status, we're going to have to gather very specific documents just so we can show that they've maintained status. So for example, for F1 students, we would need copies of all their I-20s issued to date, just to show that they've maintained status in the US, as well as any employment authorization cards.
Okay. And let's talk about what sort of jobs qualify, because I think it's important for employers that have recent grads working for them on OPT or STEM OPT, or you're about to make offers to people who are going to graduate in May or June. Not all jobs count. And from the flip side, people in other countries who are thinking about applying to a job now to be included in the H-1B lottery, not every job can work. So how does the government think about the job type for an H-1B?
So I think the starting point really is how specialized is the job? Does it require a minimum of a bachelor's degree in a specific field? And that's really the starting point. And when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it as attorneys, we start to look at some of the government resources, such as the Occupational Outlook Handbook, their wage library, just to see how specific occupations are coded by the government, because they actually will assign levels to occupations, which will tell us whether or not they consider those positions to be jobs that require a bachelor's degree.
And they also have implications for the essentially like the minimum wage for the H-1B that employers have to pay.
Exactly. So that's another tie-in. So we're looking at a lot of variables as we put together these H-1B cases. So once we figure out that job description, we have to make sure that job is a professional job, right? And then the next step is, what is that prevailing wage that the government is requiring that's paid as a minimum for that position?
What are some jobs that are professional probably, and what are some jobs that are likely not professional, especially in the tech industry?
So, we see a lot of software developers. Those are kind of the bread and butter, I would say, of H-1Bs. They're pretty straightforward. Those are very highly skilled positions. But then when you start to go to lower level, like programmer type positions, some entry level analysts, those are jobs that might not truly require a bachelor's degree, or the government might push back and say they don't think that they're highly specialized.
Hey, I'm super excited to share that we're launching Extraordinary Ability Bootcamp. This is the place to go for companies who want to support their team members to succeed at U.S. immigration options that don't involve a lottery and can lead to a sooner priority date for green cards. Your key team members can learn everything they need to know about strengthening an immigration application in the EB-1A, EB-2 NIW, and O-1A categories. Check out the show notes for more information, and when you sign up, you can use promo code ILTS for a 20% discount. Thanks, and looking forward.
Okay. So in the STEM fields, in engineering, not every job is professional enough. We do have to look at it. And other things I've seen, and I'm curious to hear your perspective. Sometimes people want to know for a chief of staff, if that can get an H-1B, but I would say that's very difficult because that's more of an administrative role, not necessarily a professional role. So it might be a more stretch there. And I've even seen pushback for CEOs for that job classification. We've also gotten it approved many times for many people. So some of this is just this is why you get a lawyer for these H-1Bs. Any other ideas there or war stories?
Yeah, it's a crazy times. I know things have changed a lot with the new administration, but we're seeing a much lower request for evidence rate, which is great. But I would say that the term analyst in a job description can sometimes set off red flags. You've got to be careful about that. We see management analysts, computer systems analysts, a lot of data analysts. The resource materials from the Department of Labor don't always say that it generally requires, I think it's pretty vague how they word it, it generally requires a bachelor's degree. So we're a little bit uphill sometimes with those particular categories.
And talking about degrees, let's say we're going the software developer route. What type of degrees would you need to get an H-1B?
I would say, a bachelor's degree in computer science, computer engineering, electrical engineering, those are more typical.
Could a philosophy undergrad with a master's in computer science qualify for a software developer role?
Absolutely. So, you really just want to tap into the degree that aligns best with the job. So if somebody has multiple degrees earned in the US and abroad, we would really take a look and see where we can marry the degree to the job best.
Cool. And do you think it might be worth exploring if somebody had the philosophy undergrad, they never got another degree, but they have 10 years of software engineering experience because they were self-taught? Would that be worth exploring?
Definitely. One of the things about the degree requirement for the H-1B is that the regulations say foreign or functional equivalent. So what we can do is we can have an individual's professional experience evaluated, and in USCIS's eyes, they'll take 3 years of work experience and equate that to 1 year in a bachelor's program.
Right.
So we can work that funny formula out. And sometimes someone doesn't have a degree that matches at all, but their experience is the functional equivalent.
Or H-1Bs for college dropouts. Yeah. Or people who never went to college. Those are possible too.
Right.
It takes a little more time because we have to do all this prep work, but it is possible. And how does the type of degree you have relate to your chances of being selected in the lottery?
It doesn't relate to the selection chances. It really, I think, helps with the approvability of the case.
Okay. How about the level? So does having a master's degree help? Can you talk about the U.S. master's cap and what that means?
Sure. So the lottery that we were describing earlier in that whole timeline, it's wrapped around these 85,000 numbers that are available for the first time for H-1B beneficiaries. So of those 85,000 numbers, there's 20,000 that are set aside for those with U.S. master's degrees or higher.
So master's or higher. So a master's degree in the U.S., a PhD in the U.S.
Exactly. But you want to make sure that it's an accredited school and that it's a nonprofit institution as well.
So like a pay for an online degree when you're in Tajikistan probably isn't going to count.
Yes. Yeah, we definitely would flag. There's certain schools that we look at carefully.
Okay. What about for people who are planning on graduating in May or June of 2020? What year is it? So we're talking about May or June of 2023. Let's say they've been put in the lottery in March and we find out if they're selected, but they haven't graduated yet with either their, either bachelor's or master's. What do we have to keep in mind about the timing of filing their H-1Bs?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I know a lot of people say, going back to that U.S. master's cap that we spoke about, can I qualify for the U.S. master's cap? I'm not going to get my degree until May, and the registration's in March. So there is flexibility. That's what's great about this registration system. As long as the individual, if they're selected under the lottery and we're using that U.S. master's, that degree has to be conferred before the H-1B petition is filed with USCIS. So in that timeline, so it does give you that opportunity.
So you have until June 30th, because it's always June 30th, right? So
yeah, right. Yeah. So April 1 is when the lottery numbers are selected, and then you have a 90-day filing window. Through June 30th.
And that's applicable also just for somebody who earned their bachelor's degree for the first time. I mean, hopefully they have their OPT ducks in a row, but proving that bachelor's degree, we can file after the degree is conferred.
Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes it's hard to get that paper degree in hand. So we can work with you to get a letter from the registrar. We could take the final transcript that shows the degree was conferred. So there's other evidence that they'll accept as well.
Do they? Probably we should be more professional than including a selfie with your cap and gown.
Yeah, that's not going to fly.
Corroborating evidence.
Yeah, maybe a marriage case,
it's
but
like
no.
A marriage case. Yeah, the wedding cake. The same. Oh, I don't know if you heard about this case once, but there was like a marriage fraud ring that USCIS uncovered once because an adjudicator recognized the same wedding gown and wedding cake for all these people who were getting married in Florida. It was like a drive-through pretend wedding set up. One costume
wow, that's
change,
crazy.
One scene change.
Wow.
Don't do that, people. Okay, well, here's another one. I bet you get this a lot, especially now that people are really eager to travel again. How does travel work while you're going through the H-1B lottery and with an H-1B?
Yeah. So let's say you are selected on the lottery and you find out April 1, yay, I was selected, I can file. If you're already in the US in another non-immigrant status, such as an F1 student, we can file the lottery as a change of status. So we can ask CIS just to change you from F1 to H1, make it effective October 1. Now, the problem arises if you travel while the change of status is pending. That can result in abandonment of the change of status request.
Dun, dun, dun. Are you stuck outside the country? Do you lose your H-1B forever? What happens?
So fortunately, you don't lose your H-1B forever. So USCIS can still adjudicate it, but how they would adjudicate it is for something we refer to as consular processing, meaning you have a paper approval of an H-1B in your hand, but you have to travel to your home country, apply for a visa stamp, and then re-enter on or after October 1 to activate that H-1B status.
That can be a pain. You might be able to get back in if you still have a valid F1 visa and your OPT has been approved and you have the work permit, but you might have to put off getting your H-1B. But if you're at the beginning of your OPT, sometimes we advise people to do consular processing if they're from India or China and they're at the beginning of their OPT and STEM OPT 3 years, and they're not confident that they'll have an employer sponsor them for a green card once they're on H-1B. Sometimes people deliberately set up their H-1Bs for consular processing and don't go for the quote unquote visa stamping until they're ready to actually activate that status.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you've got to weigh your pros and cons in those situations. I mean, what we worry about right now is the unpredictability with the embassies that we've seen since the pandemic. There can be long waits to get a visa stamp, 6 months or more at some embassies.
Yeah. And some countries and consulates are still doing visa issuance without interview. Like they'll waive the interview requirement, but that still seems to me very spotty and like each consulate is different, right?
Definitely. Yeah. The rules can be different in each jurisdiction. So it's a bit unpredictable, I would say.
And I think that policy was supposed to sunset at the end of 2022 as well. So we'll have to see if it's reissued for 2023.
Yeah, I hope so, because that's, I think, helped to alleviate some of the backlog that we've seen.
A lot of people.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So bottom line, if you're in the US, don't leave unless you get your permission from your lawyer, your school, and your employer, and you have a clear plan.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of students will come to us while they're in F1 status. And I always say, just check in with your school and make sure you have all the right documents. And, as you mentioned, Sophie, that visa stamp, that F1 visa stamp, you want to have that in your passport. You don't want to be applying for an F visa stamp if you have an H-1B petition pending or newly approved.
Right. And some countries, the F visa stamps like China, they're issued for 6 months or a year now, and they're only valid for single entry. So you might not have a multiple entry F1. You have to check.
Yeah, exactly. They have the reciprocity schedules that will tell you, but those are always changing. And so there's some individuals that have those short duration, one entry F1 visa stamps that can be really restrictive.
So then just to overly clarify here, if you're in the US and you do a change of status for an H-1B, do you have to go get a visa stamp?
No, you don't have to go get a visa stamp. It's hard because I think so many folks think about the visa stamp as being their status because it's such an important item to have in your passport. But if you're in the US, you've done a change of status from F1 to H1, it's now October, you're in H1B status. You don't have to take any steps to make that H-1B effective. That approval notice, that change of status makes that effective. The only time you have to get that H visa in your passport is if you plan to travel. And to re-enter the U.S., almost like a plane boarding pass, you need that valid H-1B visa stamp to come back in.
So there's permission to get in and there's permission to be here, and they're two different things.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay. Now, what about people who are thinking of like, hey, I'm in the US, I'm from a country where it's really hard to get a visa. I have to travel internationally, but I don't want to go back home. Are there any options to get visas in the passport from any other US embassies or consulates in other countries?
Yeah, I mean, so this is sort of a restrictive approach. I mean, there's something called TCNs or third country nationals. So if you are like an Indian national and you want to go to Canada to try to apply for your visa, they're going to give you sort of different treatment as a third country national. Each embassy in the home country gives preference to their citizens and residents. So there can be more scrutiny applied. Some embassies simply just won't accept third country national processing of visa stamps. So it's really something you have to look at on a case by case basis. But generally, the best way to get that visa stamp is in your home country. There'll be much less scrutiny and much less red tape.
Yeah. In the olden days, a lot of people would go to Canada or Mexico. That in COVID, that got really restricted. And then we had weird things like British people trying to go to South Korea for their visas, or Australians trying to go to the Caribbean. So all of that just takes a lot of research based on your countries of citizenship, your country of residence, which country you think you want to go to, if you need a visa to go to that other third country. So it's complicated. So I'm still telling people, like, don't travel unless you have to.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, because we're even seeing people leave the U.S. and have an appointment all lined up, and then the appointment gets canceled for their visa. That's not good.
Who knows? It could take 3 months, 6 months, a year.
Exactly. Yeah. And the other thing about third country national processing is if it's the second time you're applying for an H-1B visa stamp and you decide to go to another country, I feel like there's more flexibility there.
Oh, interesting. Okay. But first time, there's going to be more scrutiny and maybe more issues if you're in a third country. Okay.
Right.
Okay. We talked a little bit about speed and premium processing earlier, but could you just clarify for premium processing why people initially do it? You mentioned that if there's a denial, there's better options for review and communication is more streamlined, but does it affect your chances of being selected in the lottery?
I wish it did, but it does not.
Okay. It's not a pay-to-play system.
No.
If it were just a bidding war and the people who wanted to pay the most for an H-1B could get access to it, then that would be like American capitalism at its finest, and it would pay for everything USCIS wants to do, and they would not need any more congressional bailouts, just saying.
Wow. That's crazy. I couldn't imagine that world. But yeah, I mean, premium processing, the pitch there is, again, you get that 15 days of processing, but if there's a problem, you have someone you can communicate with. I think they're more staffed to deal with complex issues. And
since we have this electronic lottery, their ability to adjudicate premium processing cases seems to be improved in the second quarter and the third quarter. It seems like they've been able to do those faster than they did when there was still the paper-based lottery.
Yeah, definitely. So that is a huge change because prior to the, registration-based lottery system, oftentimes CIS would say, we don't have capacity for premium processing this cap season. And they would just shut that valve off and then turn it on later and say, now we'll accept them.
Last year, they didn't cancel premium processing.
No,
so
they didn't put any restrictions. And we've even seen them say, hey, we'll do premium processing, but we're not going to start that 15-day clock until day 30. They've toyed with the numbers a little bit, but last year was.
I think they're finally getting it dialed in because there also weren't any second lotteries in 2022. Like over the last few years, there had been a second or third round of more people getting selected in July or September, November. But this year it's just been one. So they've got their numbering system straight. Their statistical funnel or whatever that is.
Yeah, that was really interesting because usually you've got that pool of unused numbers, but you're right. Yeah. Maybe they've better metrics and they figured it out. So no wait list this year.
Yeah. Okay. How about taxes? Do you get H-1B tax questions? And can you tell us about how you're supposed to pay taxes when you're working on an H-1B?
So one thing to keep in mind particularly for F1 students. When you're in F1 status, you often don't have to pay the federal FICA taxes. But when you convert over to H-1B status, that tax treatment changes. The employer is required to deduct and you must pay those FICA taxes.
Okay, so that's important for employers to be aware of, to get their payroll updated when somebody goes from having a work permit as an F1 student to being in H-1B status in the U.S. and working.
Exactly.
Oh, but that raises another point that sometimes people ask, because sometimes the prevailing wage for an H-1B is higher than what they're currently paying at an early stage startup. That can be a stretch. Like, nobody wants to actually pay that wage. The employee doesn't want it. The startup doesn't want it, but they'll have to do it for the government. But the wage doesn't kick in unless somebody's actually on H-1B, right? So like if you're on OPT and you select consular processing and you don't leave the country and you don't get a H-1B stamp in your passport and come back in, you're not subject to that higher wage, right?
Exactly. So like the scenario you talk about, I call it like putting that H-1B approval in your pocket, right? Mm-hmm. So you have the approval, yay, you have that beneficial tax treatment. You could wait to activate that H-1B. That also gives you more H-1B time down the road. You can use your work permit. So that is definitely something that can be explored. Okay, great. Lynda, what are your final thoughts and tips on how people can start preparing for the H-1B lottery season that is coming up? I mean, I can't stress enough to make sure that you have all of your immigration status documents collected in a clear, and I like to see everything very sequentially so I can do that timeline when I look at the documents. So try to make sure you've got those clean copies. If you're missing I-20s, now's the time, if you're an F1 student, to try to track those documents down. Also keep a close eye on your passport, because when we're doing that registration online system in March, we need to enter in your passport information, and you should have a valid passport for that step. So try to take those steps now to get your passport renewed if it needs to be. Those are great tips. Thank you so much, Lynda. This is super helpful. Thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. You're so welcome. This is fun. Thank you so much for inviting me. You're so very welcome. We'll do it again. And to all of our listeners, check out our show notes for resources, including our newsletter, which has the latest immigration updates and strategies that we like to educate people about. You can listen to this podcast on Apple, Alexa, Spotify, Google Podcasts. We really appreciate it when you rate, review, and share it with a friend. Thanks for listening, and talk to you next time.